Monokuma returns with a new round of killing game, this time ditching the dark and claustrophobic hallways of the first game to a more brighter and open setting, with a new cast of characters and more despair-inducing plot twists. Danganronpa 2 Goodbye Despair is a sequel to the first game, Trigger Happy Havoc. It was originally released for the PlayStation Portable in 2012 and later gets localized in 2014. And just like the first game, it's available for the PSVITA, PS4, PC, Mac, and Linux.
Danganronpa.
Standing in front of Host Peak Academy is Hajime Hinata, our protagonist of the story, and is a freshman student who arrived at the elite high school for the reason that he admires it so much. But then all of a sudden, he finds himself in a mysterious place with nothing but a door in the middle of it, and when he steps inside, he meets 15 other students staring back at him. Then out of nowhere, a giant chihuahua appears before them named Usami, who claims to be their teacher and reveals that they are on an island for a heart-throbbing school trip. While everyone was a little bit suspicious about their situation at first, Usami tried to calm them all down and explained that to be able to finish the school trip, they must gather all hope fragments by building relationships with other students on the island. And these students are Chiaki Nanami, the ultimate gamer, Nagito Komeira, the ultimate lucky student, Fuyuhiko Kuruzuyu, ultimate yakuza, Gundam Tanaka, the ultimate breeder, Nekomaru Nidai, ultimate team manager, Sonya Nevermind, the ultimate princess, Mikan Sumiki, the ultimate nurse, Hyoko Sayanji, ultimate traditional dancer, Ibuki Miura, the ultimate musician, Kazuichi Soda, the ultimate mechanic, Peko Pekuyama, ultimate swordswoman, Mahiro Koizumi, the ultimate photographer, Akane Owari, ultimate gymnast, Teruteru Hanamura, the ultimate cook, and Byakuya Togami, the ultimate affluent progeny. But their piece is soon cut short by a familiar voice, who instructs all of the students to gather at Jabberwock Park, where there, the mysterious voice reveals itself to be Monokuma. While Usami tried to stop him from taking over the island, she is soon defeated and has her appearance and name changed to become Monokuma's little sister, Monomi. Once Monokuma has taken control of the situation, he announces that a new round of killing game has begun. Danganronpa 2's story and characters are far more superior to the first game. The story is crazy and unpredictable, and all of the motives are new and inventive. From a video game inside a video game motive to forced starvation, every single thing has been cranked up for the sequel. And the new cast of characters are even more lovable and memorable, with an over-the-top design and personalities, like Gundam and Ibuki. And almost every one of them is well written enough that even its weakest characters can still be a bit charming. Aside from the free time events, there are also secret events that you can trigger by talking to some specific characters with a specific item at hand, which lets you have more look to some of the characters' lives on the island. One of the issues from the first game was that some of the characters who died very early on didn't really get a lot of development, but thankfully that isn't the case with this sequel. Every character is given enough screen time and backstories, even outside of the free time events, which is why even if they might have died early on, their character still develops and has a bit of depth to them.
You're hogging all the food!
However, some of the characters do feel like a rehash of the characters from Trigger Happy Havoc, like Akane just being Aoi 2.0, and Kazuichi being a funnier and more relevant Yasuhiro. While some of these similar characteristic traits are done intentionally, I can't help but feel like some of them just became a cliche of their own. And it does take a while for them to actually form a bond as a group, unlike the characters from the first game, which makes it feel like they don't have an actual connection to the protagonist. And this supposedly love interest felt so forced, and came out of nowhere. It's like a Mary Sue paired with a flawed protagonist. You are not Kirigiri. And speaking of the protagonist, I was a little bit skeptical about Hajime at first. He just kind of annoyed me in the prologue. I mean, everyone was already fine with the whole school trip idea. But then there's Hajime, who kept on doubting and panicking each time he introduces himself. Yes, his reactions were realistic, but this is already the second game, and we already know what we're playing and the situation that they are in. Now if Hajime was the protagonist of the first game where we don't know the rules of the killing game and had no idea who the people in the game were, then sure, doubt all you want. But for us players experiencing a new round of killing game, we no longer doubt every single student that we see, and we just wanna see them all survive. Though thankfully he does get better at chapter 2, once his doubtful personality has been abandoned. It's just a shame that his introduction as the protagonist was full of doubt and suspicion. Now, I never really got to talk about Monokuma in the first Danganronpa experience, which is my fault, but now I can actually talk about him. And I think Monokuma is such a lovable, great villain. He manages to be both menacing and adorable at the same time, and is also sporting the very iconic look. And while yes, the real villain for the sequel is pretty weak and just appeared in the story out of nowhere, Monokuma as his standalone villain is one great of a villain. And along with him is his own rival and little sister, magical miracle girl Usami. Unlike Monokuma, Usami or Monumi actually wants the student to survive the killing game and even helps them on some occasions. But she does have a secret of her own which makes her a little bit suspicious. While all of the characters do hate Usami, I for one absolutely love her. I think I even love her more than the characters themselves and Monokuma. I mean, she's such a great character who has helped the students from beginning to end. But then, all she got was just abused by Monokuma and the students. She's such an underrated character. And I love her rivalry with Monokuma and her own little short segment in the middle of the class trials, where she would remind the players to save frequently. It's so adorable.
No, I'm not gonna believe it.
Dialogue is even funnier than the first game. I couldn't stop laughing at some of the jokes, that I even forgot that it was even a mature game in the first place. So when chapter 4 came, the shift in tone took me by surprise. And I believe the dialogue is even more vulgar in the sequel. I mean, almost every single character curses every single 5 minutes. Especially Fuyuhiko and Sayonji.
Yeah, we already know that, you trashy skank.
While Danganronpa 2's premise does sound a bit similar to the first game, this sequel is not just a simple new round of the killing game. Every single subplot and plot twist are intriguing and shocking. Even if some of it is just an exact mirror of the events of the first game, it's still presented in such a refreshing way and even subverts the player's expectations. However, Danganronpa 2 is not perfect, and it still has some pretty weak aspects to it, and it's not great at foreshadowing events, like the despair-inducing subplots which just came out of nowhere, and the supposedly shocking plot twist in the finale about an important character who just appeared in the game, also out of nowhere. There's also a twist about a character from the cast who never got mentioned again in the final class trial. And I'm pretty sure that Danganronpa 2 doesn't have an actual team, unlike the first game's hope versus despair. Well, yes, there's Nagito who shoves a lot of hope into the characters' faces. I don't think it's as well done as the first games. And the new executions, while wackier and more over the top, do feel a bit unsatisfying. Some are just way too tame compared to the first game. Well, yes, the wacky execution does make sense in the game's context, just seeing them all play out feels very underwhelming. Danganronpa 2 plays exactly as the first game, trigger Happy Havoc. So there's really no point in explaining every single mechanic, so instead, I'll explain all of the new minigames and improvement that the sequel has. Starting with the new 2D side-scrolling segment. At first, exploring the many islands like a 2D side-scroller was kind of fun, but after a few minutes of just walking around in a straight long line, it kind of got a bit tedious. It even makes the map pointless since you'll be walking around in a very pixelated 2D environment. But the map displays everything like it's in 3D, which makes it very confusing. When you run, it's just a long straight line, so when the game forces you to go to a specific location to progress the story, it makes the pacing very slow. Now, yes, there's the fast travel button, but it took me 20 hours to know that there's actually one. I just thought it couldn't teleport anywhere, since it's not on the map. I don't remember the game ever explaining this, because if it did, I wouldn't have forgotten such an important feature. But at least when you walk around this never-ending straight line, it's not a complete waste of time, as you'll also be assigned to take care of a pet inside your student handbook. There are different kinds of pets for you to take care of. You can give them gifts to provide them hope and remove their despairs. And the more hopes they have, the better kind of pets will hatch from the cocoon. Every step you take is important, as this will only be the only way for you to raise them. Now, taking care of the e-pets isn't really necessary, and the game won't punish you if you let one die. It's mostly just there to make the tedious side-scrolling segment less boring. And when exploring the islands, you can also hunt for some Monokuma figures hiding in some parts of the map. This hidden Monokuma serves as the game's collectibles and one of the few sources of Monokuma coins. And then there's the class trial minigames, which is just a complete despair. All of these minigames have a very long explanation to their mechanics to help the player, but it just ended up being overwhelming instead. Whenever a new class trial starts, I mostly just sigh, instead of feeling sadness and enjoyment from the death and upcoming thrill ride. While yes, the Danganronpa games aren't really the best at explaining video game mechanics, as seen at the first game's unlockable simulation minigame, but these minigame explanations are just unacceptably bad. It made almost every single one of them feel like a chore.
I'll start explaining.
There are some new minigames added to spice things up in the class trials, and one of these new additions is the logic dive, where you must clear an obstacle inside Hajime's mind by answering a multiple choice questions. It was kind of enjoyable at first, albeit very slow and long, which ultimately drags the pacing of the class trials. And there are also some levels where it was kind of disorientating to the point where I almost wanted to puke, especially on the 3rd and 5th class trial. And then there's the stupid obstacles that would appear literally in front of you without even any kind of indication that they're actually there. Basically, you are just blindly guessing the correct path, and you're only given 1 second to react to the obstacle, which is a very cheap way to add difficulty to an otherwise fun yet very flawed minigame. And the second new minigame is spot selection, where you must select a specific item in the presented area to be able to correctly piece together some evidence in the class trials. It's just a simple point-and-click minigame, and it's one of the least entertaining new additions to the class trials. It's not bad or broken, it's just too simple and forgettable. And the final new minigame is the rebuttal showdown. It's very similar to the non-stop debate, where words would fly across the screen, but instead of shooting, you must slice all of the words to get their contradictions to show. It's a pretty neat idea, but just like the other minigames that I'll mention later, it is very overwhelming. Multiple arguments will fly all over the screen, and you must slice all of them as quickly as possible. Sometimes it's just way too fast that I couldn't even understand what was happening, so I don't even know which weak point I must slice, which makes the minigame just a long trial and error. And not to mention how if you've somehow managed to get a weak point to show, you must slice it by picking one of the 3 or 5 possible truth bullets. But with only a little time to choose the correct blade, it is almost impossible to get this right in just one try. The remaining minigames are a supposedly improvement to their first game's counterpart, but overall just feel like a downgrade. The bullet time battle, now called Panic Talk Action, is one of the minigames that has been improved, and in a way, it is much better than the first game's counterpart. It's a lot easier to take in now, unlike the first game's PTB. But it is still very overwhelming. Again, a lot of things are happening on the screen all at once, which makes it very hard to focus. And it also replaced the gun team with just a typical rhythm game design, with shields I guess. Which is odd, since it still retains the reloading aspect. So basically it's a simple rhythm minigame with no actual connection to the theme of the main game, but has a random reloading mechanic forced into it to add difficulty. The non-stop debate has also seen a few changes and additions to its mechanics. It still plays the same as the first games, where you must shoot down all of the contradictions in the students' arguments. But now, you can also argue with your fellow classmates to solidify proof, which makes the class trials even more refreshing. And the white noises that appear in the non-stop debates as a distraction have been modified to be an actual difficulty in the game. Now, it requires you to hit them multiple times to be able to get rid of them entirely. And oh boy is it awful. And it gets super difficult at chapter 3, where the screen is just full of white noises. And the only way to get rid of this easily is by spending your free time events to a specific character. Now the problem with this is that if you really want to stop the noises, then you are forced to spend time with a character that you may or may not even like. Why? And then there's the depressing improved Hangman's Gambit, where you must pair a set of letters together to complete the missing word. When I was trying to solve Chapter 1's Hangman's Gambit, I literally wanted to cry. Just like the PTA, so many things were appearing on the screen all at once, with different speeds, and on top of that, I was also trying to solve the word in my head. And then all of a sudden, boom, explosion. It was a nightmare. Whenever I think I'm close to solving the word, I always get distracted by the constant explosions. And I was also trying to avoid the letters from clashing that I would forget about the answers and start all over again. Then there's also the sensitive controls, where the words would explode by themselves even if I've only clicked the left button once. But the worst thing of all would be that I didn't even know some of the words. It's such a despair-inducing minigame. It can't even do what it's supposed to do. I mean, some of the words that are different from one another spawn at the exact same place. So even before they appear on the screen, they would explode instantly. So you're basically losing lives and you have no control over it. It's a brokenly difficult game. This minigame almost made me want to quit Danganronpa. Closing Argument also returns with a new design and mechanic, and this is honestly the only actual improved minigame in here. They finally added hints for every panel, and you must solve the entire manga in just one session, which fixes the pacing issue in the first game. It's a shame that out of all the 7 improved and new minigames, only one of them is actually good and not broken. Some are just either too overwhelming or disorientating. And I can't believe it. Danganronpa 2 is such a great game, and it surpasses the original in almost every single way. Which is so depressing and bad that I honestly wanted to give up on the game itself. What's so good about Trigger Happy Havoc's minigames was that it was easy, so that while playing, you can still lay back and think about the solution to the problem. But here, it all just shoves you everything all at once. If the player wanted a very difficult minigame forced to them, then I would think that they just play a real game instead. I mean, most visual novel games are supposed to be enjoyed for its simplicity and story, not a full-on game that has to have a deep and confusing mechanic. That is why a lot of people that aren't great at video games still plays visual novels. Because not only can it provide a great story, but they also wouldn't have to be confused by different mechanics that a typical video game has. The simulation minigame also makes a return in the sequel, as Dangan Island huge panic at the heart-throbbing school trip. Just like Trigger Happy Havoc's school mode, it serves as a what-if story where Monomi won her fight against Monokuma, and the students have 51 days to be able to gather all hope fragments. It plays exactly as school mode, where you must gather materials all around the island and hang out with your favorite characters. There's really no significant changes and additions made to this minigame, so there's really not a lot of things to talk about. But Dangan Island actually debuted first in the original PSP release of the sequel, which makes school mode just a reskin. If Dangan Island couldn't fulfill your cravings and you want more, well, you're in luck, as Danganronpa 2 is jam-packed with unlockable content. One of this is the new magical girl, Miracle Monomi. Here, we take control of the giant chihuahua turned into Monokuma's little sister, Monomi, as she tries to defeat the 5 Monobis guarding each of the islands. This minigame is immediately unlocked once you finish the first chapter of the main story, and once you start playing, it immediately drops you off the island to fight with no explanation of the controls whatsoever. So before starting the minigame, I suggest you look to the controls first, so you wouldn't just be running around and jumping randomly the whole time like I did. Once you finally got the hang of the controls and get to play for 5 minutes, you basically experience everything that this minigame has to offer. Unlike the island mode, this one doesn't really have a lot of replayability to it. Each stage plays exactly the same as the other, where you must survive a couple of rounds to defeat a few enemies, and at the end of the stage, you must fight one of the Monobis that appears in the game as the final bosses. Now, to be able to attack them, you must form a circle using Monomi's wand. The problem with this is that some enemies usually tend to go to the corner of the map, which makes it very difficult to attack them because of the invisible walls that prevents you to create a circle. While it may feature the adorable Monokuma and is canon to the main story, it's really not enough of an incentive for me to keep playing. I just stopped playing after the 3rd stage and never came back. The final unlockable content is Danganronpa If. It's another what-if story of Trigger Happy Havoc. But this time, the story plays out from the perspective of a spoiler character from the first game. There's a total of 5 chapters and it's pretty good. I can't really explain more about it as it would spoil a lot of the story of the original Trigger Happy Havoc. Sadly, and oh so thank God, Danganronpa 2 never received an anime adaptation, so I won't be looking at any of those. However, at the end of the first game's anime, Monokuma has made a small cameo hinting of a possible Danganronpa 2 anime, which we know never happened. And there's also a direct sequel of Danganronpa 2 named Super Danganronpa 2.5, but we will take a look at it for the next episode. Danganronpa 0 is a light novel separated into 2 volumes. It takes place before the events of Trigger Happy Havoc, and the story revolves around a girl named Ryoko Otonashi who is suffering from a constant memory loss. It isn't really necessary to know the events of this recall novel. Well, yes, it answers some of the questions that were left hanging in the first game, and it has one crazy plot twist. It's really more of a world building than an actual story that progresses the story. This one never really got any official English release. However, a fan translation does exist online for the people who would like to read it. And there's also a great summary of the events made by a YouTuber named Oni Black Mage. And the link for the video would be in the description. Also, never ever play, watch, or read a prequel first. Never. There's a reason why prequels are never released first. And that's the whole Danganronpa 2 experience. For the next episode, we will travel to Towa City. In the spin-off title, Danganronpa Another Episode Ultra Despair Girls. And we will also be taking a look at another anime in the franchise, and the final chapter in the Hope's Peak saga, Danganronpa 3 and Danganronpa 2.5.